So when they reopened the banks after this holiday, like I was saying, all the gold backing of the currency, so the real money in the system, was now out of the system, and the Federal Reserve notes were now based on essentially our promise to pay as U.S. citizens. From that point forward, all the money, right, the things of real value, the gold and silver coin, were completely removed from our monetary, financial, and banking systems.
All right. I'm here today with Andy Kaufman, Dr. Andrew Kaufman. Thank you so much for coming back and talking to me. The last time we had a conversation, I didn't have a podcast. Now I do. So you're officially a guest on my podcast, The Human Freedom Project, and I'm really excited to be talking to you today.
Well, it's great to see you again, and I'm glad you're back with a new project.
Thank you. All right. So we were just chatting a little bit before getting started recording here, and my audience is going to be somewhat familiar with these 5 primary constraints that we're working with: the body, relationships and social life, money and economics, the state, and environments. So Andy and I decided we were going to start talking about money. Economics and law inevitably will be involved in that, because while Andy could speak to all of these constraints, and I'm going to invite him back to do that, this is where he is the most interested right now. And so I know that, Andy, one of the best ways to learn is to teach, and you are learning right now. You're a student of these things. And so this is an opportunity for us to be students with you, for you to teach us some of what you're learning. So maybe give us a little background about your journey the last couple of years looking into money, economics, and law. And why are we talking about law when we're talking about money?
Absolutely. Well, I think there's a couple of important factors here. I actually started looking into this, in the pre-COVID era. Initially, actually, we had run into each other at the Red Pill Expo, right, which is run by Edward Griffin, right, who is the author of, the Creature from Jekyll Island. So I had been introduced to that book and knew a little bit about our monetary and financial system. And, earlier on I had done a little bit of study of basic economics. But really it was, during COVID that a couple of things happened. Is one, the entire, global financial and trade system was, interrupted significantly. We all, experienced that directly, right, with, for example, business closures, with shortages of goods, with some things being really expensive, like, for example, rental cars were very, very difficult to get at all. And if you got it, it was, like 3 times the normal price, because there was some, issue with semiconductor supply chains, right? And there were lots of supply chain issues. So that, greatly affected the situation. Then, secondly, you also had this major initiative of governments and central banks to start buying up the world's precious metals and really kind of empty the reserves of the exchanges by taking possession of many of the metals. And this was in conjunction with what's known as the BRICS, which is a multinational organization that's affiliated with a major infrastructure project that is not being settled in the U.S. dollar. And they're, talking about kind of breaking away from the dollar as the world reserve currency. And there's other aspects of this too, with some of the Middle Eastern oil-producing nations doing deals outside the dollar. Even France doing a natural gas deal with China in the Chinese yuan. So this, was kind of an important clue that the financial system is changing worldwide, and I don't even really understand how this works. And then lastly, because of the abuse of our natural rights during COVID, in other words, and the governments often didn't do this directly. They used private businesses through, bribery or contracts with lucrative payoffs to get them to violate your rights. And, so I said I needed to study law to understand that. And I realized that these things were all interconnected, that there's actually law governing all of this commercial finance system. And what we call money is not really money. And I'll explain that as we go along. But I realized too that the main financial pundits out there, and I'm not even talking about the ones on, Fox News and CNN or that are reported in the Wall Street Journal, but the ones who are supposedly looking at things that are, not approved for primetime media, are still not really aware of some of the basics of what's going on. For example, they're not aware that there's been a major die-off of work-aged people, and that it's majorly affecting employment and unemployment numbers. There's only really one economist who's acknowledged that, and when he talks about it on anyone else's platform, he's generally hushed. So, that's a really important aspect. And despite, that it's just written right in the law, these bankers and financiers don't really know how our currency comes into existence. Something very, very basic like that.
Yeah, I just wanted to pause you because I want to make sure to take the audience along for the ride with us. So you have an audience that is probably pretty familiar with this history, or at least
I wouldn't say that's the case.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting, right? My audience, some of my audience is and some isn't. So I have no idea who's going to end up wanting to listen to this podcast consistently. But like you, I wasn't an MD, but I was in the healing arts, and had to get a license, because that's what they tell you if you're going to touch bodies and work with people. And anyway, and then I gave up my license in 2011. And anyway, so I started learning how these things are enmeshed and commingled. But I grew up with a money historian father. So I grew up handling gold and silver coins, learning the history of money. I knew about, I think I met Edward Griffin in Costa Rica at some event my dad took us to when I was 17. I came very close to sending back my social security number, my card, when I was 17. I'm very glad I didn't do it then. I had no idea how to do that right. So I've sort of been peripherally aware of all this my whole life, but it wasn't like my vocation, and it wasn't something I was trying to broadcast to the world. It was just a personal interest of mine. But obviously, like you with the whole COVID thing, it sort of became apparent to me that it had to now be public. It had to be broadcast. You really need to be aware of these things because it's affecting every area of life. So where would you start with us through, understanding money? If we were going to start somewhere, right?
Right. Well, I think a good place to start is in 1933.
Great. Let's start there.
But let me just, give a slight background to that and say that there was a different system of money in place when, this country was formed. And that the definition of money, it's in the Constitution, right? And it's gold or silver coin. Coin being actual piece of the metal that is stamped by the authority of government, according to Black's law. And it says that no state shall settle debt or accept, payment for debt except in gold and silver coin. So that's the United States definition of money. There are monetary theorists who might talk about various economic attributes of money, like fungibility and being able to divide it into smaller amounts. I forget the technical name for that, and a couple of other properties, right? But those are all true of gold and silver. And most importantly, it's got to be something that has actual value. And those metals have always had value throughout history. In fact, some people have done a analysis back to ancient Rome and to look at, for an ounce of gold or an ounce of silver, what could you buy back then from, historical documents? And it's basically comparable to what you can buy now. I think it was an ounce of gold can buy you a very fine suit, which it could still buy you today, right? So these things have stood the test of time, whether you like them or not. And then we had, in the early 20th century, the introduction of the Federal Reserve, or a central bank. So the central bank was began making the currency, but it was always backed by gold that was held by the United States Treasury until 1933. So what we had in 1933 was, a culmination of the aftermath of the Great Depression, which was really a problem different from what we have right now with it, which is inflation. It was deflation. And it was essentially, you could look at it and it was pretty much done purposely by the Federal Reserve through their monetary policy of not producing enough currency in circulation. So think if you're a business and you're expanding, or your cash flow is falling short and you need to, pay your overhead or buy more raw materials to make more product, you would get a loan, right? But if the banks had no dollars because there was a shortage of currency, so they had nothing to loan. Now, there wasn't a shortage of gold. The Federal Reserve just could have, written more notes that were essentially like gold certificates. At that time, they just didn't do it per policy. And so this caused massive economic crisis. And then I'm unable to remember the president immediately before FDR, but he refused to do this. And so they kept this depression going until FDR was elected, because he agreed to do it. And almost immediately after taking office, he initiated and passed the Emergency Banking Act. And this basically, he took emergency authority as the chief executive. And when an emergency is declared, essentially all of the law, including the constitutional rights, go out the window in order to, be able to deal with the emergency. And this is exactly what happened during COVID. And that's how they were able to, sell tests and injections that were not approved, right? They didn't go through the evaluation process because it was an emergency situation. And so there was actually, FDR declared a series of emergencies in different sectors of the economy, and all this led to the New Deal, of course. But the Emergency Banking Act essentially declared a bank holiday so that they could change everything around. And then when they reopened, it was going to be basically all the gold and silver were out of the system. So this is when they made it illegal to own gold, and they, asked people to turn it in. And then right after they finished turning it in, of course, they increased the value of gold. So the government was able to profit on that. But aside from that, was just a little, side hustle.
Yeah. And so maybe I'll just, if you don't mind me interjecting really quick. So the Federal Reserve Act, and it will happen in 1913, or maybe right before that. I think it was on December 24th, so Christmas Eve in 1912, maybe. I'm not sure exactly. But the Federal Reserve came into existence in 1913, essentially. And that's what The Creature from Jekyll Island is about, that book that we mentioned earlier. And so it was kind of like laying a foundation, planting a seed that could then grow, and then they could, because they had to actually they had to do it this way or it wouldn't have gone over well with the public.
Right. Well, there was a lot of resistance to having a central bank in this country. Yeah. That's why they had to have the vote on Christmas Eve, because no one was there except for a few people that had planned probably to be there ahead of time so that they had just enough to pass it. And, they had worked everything out was Teddy Roosevelt, right, to make sure he would sign it into law. And he regretted it later on and made a public statement about that. But that still, because it was unpopular and difficult, right, it didn't create the exact system that the proponents wanted. So they had to kind of do things further. And you see, because they had the power to regulate the currency, in other words, set monetary policy, right, by setting interest rates and controlling access to credit, just like they do today. And, they have a million sophisticated strategies to manipulate monetary policy, that they were able to bring about this desperation situation in the economy that allowed the politicians to get away with murder, essentially. Right. So when they reopened the banks after this holiday, like I was saying, all the gold backing of the currency, so the real money in the system, was now out of the system, and the Federal Reserve notes were now based on essentially our promise to pay as U.S. citizens. So in other words, obligations of the United States. And so that means they're practically limitless and they're completely hypothecated, right? So from that point forward, all the money, right, the things of real value, the gold and silver coin, were completely removed from our monetary, financial, and banking systems. And in their place, we basically have paper. And there's really only two kinds of paper in the system. And everybody in your audience, despite they may be confused right now and not understand everything I'm saying, but they actually know exactly what these two pieces of paper, because we've all used this for virtually all our transactions, in our lives up to now. And so another word for this paper is negotiable instruments. Okay. We call it money, but it's actually not money, right? Because that has to be gold and silver coins. So this paper, and it says this, right on it. So the two kinds, they're called notes and drafts, and I'll explain what those are. But it's essentially your dollar bill, that your cash, right? Those are notes. And the checks, your checkbook, those are drafts. So you know how to write drafts, right? And if you look at the check, for example, you'll notice on there, it says paid to the order of, right? And then you write who it's to. So that is because it's an order to pay, right? You're ordering the bank to pay this party, right? The order of whoever it is you're paying. The bank holds your funds, you're writing them in order to pay. So all drafts are orders to pay, right? So they're just different, checks of different forms, right? That's one kind of paper. And then the other kind of paper, the, cash, or the dollar bills, as we call them, or what they really are is Federal Reserve notes. And according to law, a note is a promissory note. That means like a promise to pay. So just like if you take out a loan, for example, like to buy a car or a house, or whatever, you sign a promissory note, right, that says, I promise to pay, this much principal and this much interest every month over this time period, right? And so so what we're really doing in our transactions, right, every single transaction that we're engaged in, so every good or service that we buy, every fee or penalty that we pay to the government, right, pretty much every transaction that we do, all we're doing is exchanging these instruments. We're exchanging promises and we're exchanging orders, right? Sometimes we're exchanging promises for orders and orders for promises, but we're not actually exchanging any value, right? Because these things only have value because we are basically under some kind of spell saying they have value, right? Because for example, I sign a promise to pay, but then my payment is with more promises.
And so maybe I look at these things metaphorically. Like, I think it's sometimes useful to look elsewhere for a metaphor that can help us understand, like, what,
like the Monopoly board.
Yeah, like that. Or, I mean, the way that I look at it, since I work with the body, that's my thing. I work with people in pain mostly. I work with fascia, and I teach a method. And the symptoms happening in the body, as you well know, don't tell you what the cause is. And if you just treat the symptoms, or you don't like the symptoms because they're painful or uncomfortable and you just want them to go away, you can make things worse. You can kick the can down the road. And so that metaphor is really apt to me with economics, because as you're describing, most of us don't realize what we're even doing, just like we don't even realize what we're doing to our body a lot of the time. When we pay with these notes or drafts, checks. But then inflation occurs, and maybe we don't even know that word, but we can't buy a suit for the same amount of money as we could if we had a system backed by gold. Suddenly, everybody's going to the grocery store right now, and they're buying a couple items that, cost what an entire basket or cart would 3-4 years ago. And they don't know why, though. And then what I see people doing is that they're then begging the government for an economic solution to economic pain from the very people that caused it. And so I want to the reason I bring that in is because while I love getting to the history of it, and I think that's important to understand, it's what I also want to point to is, how do we find our way through the realities we're finding ourselves in today? So thanks for that background. I think that's super helpful. So now we're dealing with, if you want to go into the history first, because there's probably...
Well, I mean, actually, just to bridge it, right? Because just thinking what you said, to take it one step further about, right? So it used to be backed by gold. Gold is a finite resource, right? There's so much gold that exists in the world, and then each year a little bit more is extracted out, but it's pretty predictable, and actually it gets less and less over time, as sort of the resources are become more and more depleted, right? Because there's only a fixed amount of gold on Earth. Maybe we'll learn how to make it out of other things in the future, but that's one of the reasons why it holds its value. And so you can, if you just use the gold, and I'm not even talking about with currency, right? Like gold coin, right? So you couldn't fudge it. As soon as you use something to represent gold, right, which was the gold-backed currency, initially what it was just kind of dangerous to carry gold and silver around because someone could rob you. And it was, it could be, especially if it's silver, if you're carrying a lot of it, it could be very, very heavy. So they would put it into a bank for safekeeping, and the bank would give them a receipt, right, saying that, they can come back and exchange the receipt for their gold anytime. And over time, people traded those receipts because the banks were trustworthy, because it was just out of convenience. And that's how the gold-backed currency came about. But you could see over time, it'd be really easy to cheat. Like, it'd be really easy to make a certificate where there wasn't gold for, right? Or to say that, we decided we don't need to keep 100% of the gold for the certificates. We only need to keep half, and we can lend out the other half, right? So you could cheat the system over time. And then that's how that Depression situation started because the Federal Reserve was cheating the system. They were keeping gold hidden and not issuing currency for it, right, to create a shortage of the currency that was artificial. But when they took the gold out, it became much more easy to manipulate because it doesn't have to be tied to any actual thing. It's kind of made up out of thin air. So depending on who's in control of regulating it, they can essentially do anything, right? So when they had, for example, over many years since the 2008 real estate crash, and especially during COVID, interest rates were set, very close to zero or even zero at some points. So that meant that all of the banks who are giving out loans, right, were giving it a very, very low interest. So it was very cheap to get money. And so what happened is people spent more, right? They bought houses or buildings that were more expensive than they could buy if it were a higher interest rate. But that's a sort of a false situation, over time, because if they very rapidly raised interest rates because inflation was created, because each time a loan is given, right? So when you're in an environment where there's more loans and the loans are for bigger amounts, each one of those loans actually brings the new currency into creation.
Let's pause here because most people don't understand. So
no, of course, even bankers don't understand this.
Yeah. So let's say I decide, I want a new credit card, and we don't really think about, okay, I'm opening a credit card and now I go spend money on credit that I don't have at the grocery store.
Right. So
where does the money come from?
You're actually creating that currency every time that you charge something on your credit card. So this is, if anyone wants to look at this in more detail, it's in the Federal Reserve Act, Section 16, paragraphs 1 and 2. And what it says essentially is that a bank or, a Federal Reserve member bank, which is almost every bank, they go to their Federal Reserve agent with an application, which would be like your application for a credit card or for a loan. And it's, their version of it. And if it's accompanied by a promissory note or several other types of instruments, different types of notes and drafts, essentially, then they give that note to the Federal Reserve agent, and then the Federal Reserve agent gives them that amount of dollars. Like, digitally, it'll just go into the bank's account. It's not like a stack of paper, right? But it's the same exact thing. And this is how almost all the currency is created. And that is an obligation of the United States or the U.S. Treasury, and actually us, because it's actually the U.S. Treasury owes it back to us. So I won't get into why it's our funds. Let's just say it comes just from the Federal Reserve, right? But they create it seemingly out of thin air, but they don't state where it comes from in the law. But it's created. Let's say that, you have a Capital One credit card, and you apply for it, then you get it, and then you go out and to the restaurant and pay for a meal. Okay. Now you get a little receipt. Now sometimes these days this is done electronically with that chip, right? That chip actually represents your signature. And there's a federal law that was passed to regulate that. But think of the paper receipt on there, right? It requires you to sign it. So you're actually endorsing that. That is actually the promissory note. And if you read the fine print there, it'll say underneath the signature line, either I promise to pay this charge or I authorize this charge according to my card member agreement, which is the contract that you have to promise to pay these promissory notes. So then, that goes electronically to Capital One. And Capital One doesn't like take their own dollars and pay the restaurant. They take that promissory note that you endorsed with your signature and they to their Federal Reserve window and trade it for that exact amount of Federal Reserve notes or, US dollars, which goes then into their account and then collects, then goes to pay the restaurant. So in other words, they didn't lend you anything. They're just a transfer agent.
And they're making a lot of money to be that transfer agent.
They're making money so they make money several ways.
Yeah.
One, the main way that they overtly make money is that the restaurant actually pays them a commission.
Yep.
Right? Or a fee for a credit card. That's why, a lot of places would prefer to take cash or charge you less for cash because then they don't have to pay the credit card company.
Mm-hmm.
Then they also take those promissory notes on the back end and they put them into a pool because they're based on your contract that you're going to pay them for that, even though they didn't lend it to you. But they put them in a pool, and that's basically like a derivative, just like the mortgage-backed securities that led to the housing crisis in 2008. And then those are, that pool is in a trust, and that trust sells shares of that pool and then pays dividends to the shareholders, which are mostly institutional investors like pension funds and hedge funds. And most of this is totally hidden to the public, but suffice to say that the banks are making money hand over fist. Now, they're, because of defaults now on these fraudulent contracts where we pay a second time to someone who didn't lend us the money, those securities, hypothecated derivatives, they're hurting, right? Because they can't pay the dividends to the shareholders, so the shareholders are selling shares and the value's going down, right, because of all the defaults. But still, all that revenue they were making from that was completely fraudulent. But, based on nothing, based on a fraudulent contract of you to pay a debt that you don't have.
Yeah. And so what I want to say right now is I could just imagine some people listening to this just nodding off, and it's like so abstract and it's so not in front of us and tangible. It's difficult to think about, and it's difficult to wrap your mind around. And I think most importantly, it's difficult to care about. But in my opinion, we need to. And so even though we're, right now just speaking to the audience, like Andy and I are talking about.
Let me put it in straightforward terms. Like what I'm just telling you is that you, Alicia, you, Joe, Rosemary, and every single one of you out there, you actually create the dollars by your signature. Anytime you sign a promissory note of any kind for any loan, a bank loan, a personal loan, a business loan, if it's with your social security number, a mortgage, any credit card charge, any of those things, your signature authorizes that money to be created out of, seemingly nothing, right? Didn't exist in the system before. Your signature creates it. And what I was talking about, all the fraudulent contract, was basically you've been tricked by the banks to making an agreement or a contract with them to pay them back that money when you actually created it in the first place.
Yeah. Oh God. It's so wild. And okay, so, but it feels maybe important to go back in time and tie, maybe continue from the history that you were talking about from 1933, because, and I'm not 100% clear on this. I haven't probably looked into it as much as you. I know more about like the prior history of money and then the current stuff. But somewhere through the period between 1913 and whenever we went off the gold standard for good, there was a period of time where birth certificates were invented, social security numbers came into existence, and these became tied to the economic system. What do you know about that? Or how did we get to this point where we are creating the money with our signature, and why does our signature have the power to do that?
Well, I mean, we don't even have to get into the issues with the birth certificate to understand that, because everything, in commerce, right, is corporations, right? And the word corporation is related to the word corpse, right? They're dead entities. A corporation can't act. They can't enter into a contract. They need the life energy to bring that about, right? So, General Electric or Apple, computer, whatever, those things can't do anything on their own. But when you have the leadership and the human energy in there, that is what allows them to do things, right? To create things, to make contracts, and do all the things that, we do as, natural men and women. So it's your life energy that is the value of that note and of the currency. And essentially it was, the system was created this way when it was changed over to be hypothecated, right? They talked about the bank's assets, but the bank's assets are all of the borrowers of the bank, right? Because before that, they actually were borrowing. They had a different kind of system. And, the currency that came into existence had to be backed by gold and silver, right? So totally different. It didn't come into existence based on a promissory note, and it was changed into that, right? So that's, how that became essentially the value, right? But how do you quantify, what it is, right? So there is almost limitless value, right, that each of us can put into that.
Well, so what just came to mind is we became the gold in a way.
Well, yes, but there's no standard exchange rate, like,
right.
or if there is, it's very high. Like it could be one, man is worth, $500 million or something like that. But I don't know of any any exchange rate that's published anywhere.
Yeah, not publicly anyway. But in a way, the my understanding, at least generally, is that our birth certificate and the Social Security number conscripts us into this system to not only generate the money, but then also to allow it to flow into channels that aren't really coming back to us, and then we pay back all. We have to pay taxes, and we have supposedly. And so
yeah, there's a number of things going on here. I mean, one thing is that nothing happens that we don't agree to at some level.
Yeah.
So we contract into these things, and we also remain, ignorant of how these things work. So, everything I explained so far is right out of the law, exactly. Now, I mean, I'm explaining it a little bit of how, in lay terms, right? But if you just go back and look at, Section 16 of the Federal Reserve Act, you'll see how it is that we create money through our promise, with a signature. And that's really kind of a fundamental, aspect. But we are not taught how the system works, and we're not taught how to utilize the system. I mean, for example, a simple thing is when we sign a check, right? Now, if you look at, and this is in what's called the Uniform Commercial Code, or the UCC, that's what governs negotiable instruments, right? Or this paper that we're talking about, and other things in banking law and in real estate, etc. But if we look at a little bit about endorsement, because when we sign a check, like on the back, like let's say we get a paycheck, like a paper paycheck, right? The old school way, not direct deposit, but we get a paper check. And then, it's made out to us, to the order of us for a dollar amount. And then we turn it over on the back and we sign our name. Now, if we just sign our name and write nothing else, that's what's called a blank endorsement. And you can look this up right in Article 3 of the UCC. And that means that as soon as we hand this over to someone else, our signature without any other language has authorized them to pretty much do whatever they want. If they want to sign it over to themselves, they can. It's perfectly legal, right? If they want to sign it over to a third party, let's say they owe someone money for refinishing their wood floors, they can actually endorse it over to that person and hand it to them as payment, and they could take it to their bank and cash it. So we just are completely ignorant to know that. Now, if we simply put the words in there for deposit only next to our signature, now we're restricting what can happen. In other words, now it can't be transferred to a third party because we restricted it saying for deposit only. Right? So since we're incompetent, we're treated as such by the government entities, right? So we have to have licenses for everything. And that's something also that largely came into effect in 1933. That in order to do regular business, now we need a license. Now, the legal basis for that actually considers us enemies of the state. It refers back to the Trading with the Enemies Act, which was from the First World War, and now classifies U.S. citizens as enemies of the state. However, we don't know that we're not really even supposed to be U.S. citizens, which is different from the original citizens of the United States of America at the founding of this country, because it was in the post-Civil War era, the whole there was another category of citizenship that was made that essentially strips away many of your rights, even your constitutional rights, and we don't even know about that. So because we are unaware, and we're probably kept that way, on purpose, there's a number of consequences. And once we start to become aware of some of these truths, we can, kind of act as adults and do things very, very differently to protect ourselves and actually to be able to access, the true abundance that we have been gifted with.
All right. So you just said a lot there that I believe is so important. You were talking about licenses and, why we need permission. And because of this enmeshment, this is what I would like to flesh out with you. There's this enmeshment between the state or the government, which in one way we could look at as law, like in its most simple sense of maybe a healthy government would simply preserve and protect the equal rights of every individual, and that's it. So law is sort of synonymous with government, but today we give the government so much power to regulate the economy and regulate education and regulate professions and tell us what is good for us for our body and to regulate healthcare and to mandate certain things. And basically the state has its tentacles in everything. So, and this is why I wanted to talk to you about money, because I have a lot of practitioners in my audience. So I have psychotherapists, I have physicians, I have doctors, I have chiropractors and body workers, massage therapists. And one of the things I've encountered in the last few years since I started teaching my methodology is I don't offer certifications because I don't believe it's my job to give someone permission to do anything. It's only my job to give myself permission. So I don't offer pieces of paper, which has really confused some people. I did in the beginning, and then I regretted it. And then they have all these questions for me, like, if I'm not certified, will anyone want to work with me? Because I don't have this piece of paper on the wall. And then how will I get insurance? And how will I, or maybe they're a licensed professional in one realm, like maybe they're a body worker, for example. And when I teach people my method, I talk about the whole human organism. So I'd love to maybe kind of tie this in a bit with the health professions that we've both kind of been involved in our separate ways, and shine a light on the fact that it is totally possible to have not only individual freedom as a human being, autonomy over our money, autonomy over our body, but also as practitioners. We can have practitioner freedom, the freedom, for example, to treat the whole human organism, and without a license, without permission. But there's something really important in this that we're getting to, which is when money's involved. I think that's where the state comes in with this, power to regulate, partly because, or maybe entirely because, we don't trust each other. I just said a lot. You can
relate it to what I was just saying. It's essentially because we are incompetent and like children. And there's even a legal philosophy called parens patriae, which essentially means, right, the government is the father figure. And we are infantilized. Kelly Brogan talks about daddy government and mommy medicine, right? Because we are incompetent children, that we need all this hand-holding. We need to be told what to do, right? We need we need to enter in agreements and be supervised. Because all these, all the licenses that you're talking about, they're contracts, right? Where you say you agree to only do what they approve because you don't know better, because you're just a child. So you have to do these sanctioned procedures, and then they're going to supervise you. And if you don't follow that, right, then they're going to give you a spanking, essentially, take your license away or something even worse.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. You agree to that, right? You sign the contract. You essentially behave as if you are that incompetent child. And, part of this is kind of realizing that we don't need to learn from any official source of information. Like, we don't need to go to a school and get a diploma. We don't need to study with a particular guru or teacher and get a certificate. What would that mean anyway? What did they have to do to get that? Did they just have to pay money? Did they have to demonstrate competency? Where's the accountability of that, right? How do you demonstrate that? A certificate could demonstrate that, or it could be completely meaningless and empty, right? So the truth is that the knowledge is out there. You can go seek it for yourself from whatever source and decide if it's valuable. So if I, come to you, Alicia, because I think you have valuable information and ask you to, or pay you to teach me, the information is the value, not your sanction.
Yeah. And I don't,
right?
God, I would not want to be put on that pedestal, or that you're going to fall real quick from that. I mean,
well, no, look, it's okay to admit that you have this knowledge, you have experience, you spent time studying, you've learned some things, while admitting, I don't have all the answers, and there are some areas I haven't really looked into. And, I say the same thing about myself. Like, you can acknowledge that. And I enjoy teaching. Like, that's my main endeavor. I feel like I'm doing that right now, even during this interview, right? But
yeah, I'm just talking about like the sanctioning and the giving permission and saying, all right, I approve you now.
That's right.
And if you don't continue to do what I say or follow the rules I laid out, I'm going to punish you.
Yeah. So there absolutely is a way, to avoid that trap. But you have to first, feel that you have the authority yourself and the sovereignty to do it on your own terms, that you learn the knowledge, you develop the skills, and then you contract privately with your clients, right? So you need to do that outside of the system where you agreed to have a license and you agreed to follow this and that and the other thing, right? So what I did is, one thing, I just let my license expired, but I didn't have as much law or legal knowledge then. So now, if I were to do it now, I would probably rescission my license agreement, which would just be asking them for a copy of the agreement. And then, you can, there's ways you can learn this, but essentially you write rescission and the date on the document, and then you send a letter that you entered into it by mistake. And that should essentially undo all your agreements to do that. You want to have a way of doing banking also that is somewhat removed from the regular system. You can establish a company and get an EIN and still use your social to open the bank account, but there's a way to make it unlienable. If you have, like, for example, a private membership association that is a member of your LLC, and then you open up the bank account in the LLC's name, and they own shares of the company, but they're undisclosed, so that's an unlienable bank account. There's other ways of doing this. You can set up a trust and open up a bank in the trust's name, private irrevocable trust. There's different kinds, an express trust. So there's a number of different ways to mechanistically do this. And I've sometimes helped individuals, not necessarily with setting up the bank account in the business, but the whole thing of how to structure it. And then, you have a private contract with your clients as well. And in there, you have to specify that you're not, there's no doctor-patient relationship, and you should learn what that means, in the law, right? So you can't do certain things like keep medical records, or at least in the standard way. So you have to be a bit conscientious about changing, what you do and how you do. Like, my model working with clients is very different because I don't do any hand-holding. Like, I teach them the information, and then if they want to take action, that's all on them. There's no lab tests, there's no physical exams or anything. It's not a doctor-patient typical medical relationship, right? It's just talking. They tell me all about the issues they want help with. I ask, questions, and then I kind of teach them what I think are the root cause and the contributing factors or other causes of their problems. And often it's not just physical. And then I say, okay, well, here are different ways that people have successfully addressed that, or, supported their body's healing through that type of an issue. And I give that, describe different options. I even tell them about other professionals that they could work with depending on what, there is relevant. And then it's up to them, right? And then I offer to be a resource to answer questions and provide information, help them interpret what's going on if they choose to carry out these, procedures. But, I don't make them come back or get follow-up tests or, there's no diagnosis or anything like that, right? Yeah. If they want to come back and ask me more and have me teach them more, I'm happy to do that. In fact, as many times it's a pleasure to develop a relationship with folks, right? But I don't pretend to do something I'm not. And, so I have a contract that with them, with each client, that specifies that carefully. And a couple of other things like, that they say that that my payment is not putting them in undue financial hardship, right? Because I don't want people going into bankruptcy to have a consultation with me and such. But it's, so basically you just think about some common things and they take, the most important thing is that they take full responsibility for making the decision of how they're going to address their health, and that whatever consequences they accept personally based on their choices. And, they're not my choices. I don't have the responsibility. And that's, part of this infantilization, right, is that we are held responsible for others, right? If you're a store owner and, you didn't even realize, but some of the snow melted and refroze and there's an ice patch and someone falls, right? Well, it's your fault. Well, I mean, what do you mean? Aren't you supposed to watch where you're walking? And, can't you notice if there's some ice there and step around it.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, yeah. Meanwhile, like I had someone ask me if I don't certify people, like if there's no like test and passing of the test or approval from me, how can I guarantee that my students won't hurt people? And it was actually not a question from he was not a stupid person, but it's this zeitgeist we're in, that we seem to think that licensed professionals are guaranteed safe haven of some sort, and it couldn't be more opposite from the truth. Because you're right. It's a very false sense of security. In fact, I was just hearing a story about a surgeon who was rose to world fame as one of the most skilled thoracic surgeons, and he was awarded a very prestigious position in Europe, and then they later found out that he was using like some cheap plastic hose to replace people's windpipe. And of course, they were failing after time, and there were horror stories and deaths. Oh my God.
And he even after that, he still didn't lose his license.
Oh my God. I know. Well, this is what I point out to people, and this is so maybe this will bring us back actually to money, and then we can wrap it up here with anything else you want to share. But this is why I believe this is so important, because, for example, you can't. My father died this year, and my mom took him to the hospital to find out why he was falling a lot. He had a leg amputation surgery 4 years ago, or I guess 5 now. But he was getting around just fine, and he had his full mental faculties intact. They took him to the hospital, and of course they had to sign a contract before he could be admitted. And nobody ever reads these things. And they were under the naive assumption that the hospital would do a few tests, maybe an MRI or a CT scan or something, and then send him home so he could get the results later. But they strapped him to a bed, drugged him, and within, a couple of days, he was hallucinating and a shell of himself. But my mom couldn't even get him out because of the documents she signed, and they have then a legal obligation.
So, this is a prime example. She absolutely could have gotten him out.
Yeah.
She was incompetent with respect to the law, so she didn't know how to get him out, right? And maybe she didn't ask the right individuals for help. But this is part of the problem, is that we don't know how to negotiate these systems. In fact, one of the things that I teach, and I'm having a free workshop next month that's going to include this, is if there's some emergency that you really do need the hospital, how do you deal with them such that they only do what you want?
Fabulous. Oh God, I'm so excited you're doing this, Andy.
It's very doable.
Yeah.
But you have to know ahead of time, about this. But it's all really related to contract law.
Yep. And which partly goes back, partly to money. So I will make sure to have all the links available for people so they can find you. And if they want to be part of that workshop, I would highly encourage them, because while I'm going to do everything in my power to stay out of the hospital system, I'm going to be very...
The whole title of the workshop is How to Avoid the ER.
Great. But, in the event that I'm in a car accident and have a leg severed or something, I don't know, yes, I'm going to... Yeah,
that's one of the very few reasons I would say that the hospital could be useful, actually. So it's a good example. But so I'm going to include in that, the times when you should go, and then how do you make sure that they treat you? Like I supervise some other health professionals, and one of them got into a situation, and I think that perhaps their spouse might have pressured them to go to the ER, but they had like a dog bite to a child on the face. And, I'm sure it was scary, right? And you want a plastic surgeon to be looking at that and fixing it up. But of course, at the hospital, what are they most concerned about? A tetanus vaccine, antibiotics. and such. And when there was some resistance put up around that, right, what do? They call Child Protective Services on you. And, it was easy ultimately for them to dispose of it, but it caused a lot of unnecessary stress and fear. And, they were really badgered and intimidated by the hospital staff. But if they had invoked the techniques that I teach, that would not have happened. The hospital staff would have been kissing their butt.
Well, this is such a needed thing that you're doing. I'm going to attend myself, and I'm sure my mom will be there as well. I was trying to help her the best I could. I was like, "Mom, you signed a contract. You got to get out of the contract," but I didn't know. And she did get him out eventually. She did everything in her, that she could do, and did get him out.
Good.
So to kind of maybe bring this back to money, which is where we started. And as you already know, and hopefully our audience is starting to figure out, these things are so enmeshed and intertwined. And this is why we really need to enlighten ourselves about each of these areas of life, because then we can't really take responsibility for our body unless we understand how our body functions and how to listen to it and how to take care of it. And the same thing is true with money. So we can't, it's up to us to actually learn about money and that economic system and how to do so in a responsible manner. So is there anything you want to share? Going back to money, I guess before you say anything, I'll just say, this is a topic we could spend, even just me and you, but it just individually, hundreds, thousands of hours on. And so, we've just barely scratched the surface, but hopefully it's inspired people to look into it a little bit. So, what do you want to maybe share with people as we kind of wrap up this topic of money today?
It's hard because there are so many directions to go, but suffice it to say, right now, we're facing a very difficult economic situation, and there are so many indicators that the bottom is dropping out. And many people, you mentioned the inflation, right? And I see this too. It's just astonishing, getting a restaurant bill or a grocery total, or even at the gas pump, and seeing how much it is, because just a couple of years ago, it seems like it was half as much in many of these instances, right? But yet we haven't seen our incomes doubling. And, that's always the problem. And, there's going to be some harder times because some of these things are, going to just go belly up, right? Like, for example, in the commercial real estate market, that everybody stopped going to the office during COVID, for example, and commercial real estate is a little bit different than residential. Like when we buy a house, most people would get a 30-year mortgage, right? So they would pay that off over 30 years, or most people would end up selling that house before that time for one reason or another. But in commercial real estate, so if I would buy an office building, for example, and finance that, they usually have 2 or 3 year loans. And what they do is they refinance at that time. And that's a way for them to pull cash out of it, the owner, if they want to. But because when they financed it, originally before the Federal Reserve started increasing the interest rates, they might have had a 3%, rate on that loan. But now when they're going to refinance, it could be 7-8%. That's a huge difference. They won't be able to afford it. So they're basically going to end up being major defaults and foreclosures on all this commercial real estate. And, also it's because they're not using the space anymore. So the leases are expiring and not being renewed. And, this is going to be part of a plan to really kind of rezone people into 15-minute cities, because already you can hear a lot of talk of plans to convert this commercial space into apartments and residential space, right? Cram as many people into the cities as possible and get them out of the rural areas where they could be self-sufficient. So I think, you'll see that kind of thing coming out of this as well.
Yeah. And so maybe I'll have you on again, because it'd be too much probably today to dive into how we navigate that, economically and legally or lawfully. So, you have a lot going on. I want to make sure to point people in any direction, or if you have anything you want to share with people that you're up to, like this workshop coming up. And actually, just we're recording this in December. I'm not 100% sure when this will go out. The workshop you're talking about, I'm imagining you're going to record it and probably make it available after if people can't attend live.
Yes, we always do that, and it's the second week of January, so okay. Maybe this show will come out in time. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure yet either. Yeah, but we'll make sure to get all the links there, because that's something I think.
And that's going to be a free workshop.
Okay.
Too, so low barrier for entry.
Okay, fabulous.
Even if you're struggling from inflation, you can still afford it.
Fabulous. Well, thank you for doing that. So you have a lot of projects going on. Are there any that you want to highlight right now and just tell people about? We can point them in that direction.
Well, I mean, that is definitely one of the big projects that I'm excited about, because, everybody wants to avoid the hospital. And I know it's always been popular, and it's fun to talk about different ways of handling these situations, because, as you know, I only teach natural healing, right? So we only use really natural materials, no pharmaceuticals or technology, of any kind. So, for example, I teach you how you can use like an aloe plant to help with wound healing. And it's a totally different way of dealing with it, and how that actually can give better cosmetic results than stitches even, which, is definitely requires a little bit of a leap of faith to do it. But, I've seen the photographic evidence, and it's quite good and very easy, because you don't need someone to, sew it up and put, artificial material, introduce that to your body. But I also, think you can learn how to do stitches yourself if you really think that's a good idea, and you can easily buy them. They'll say that they're for veterinary use, so that you don't need a license, but it's the same exact suture, because I've seen them in the operating room. And I bought the veterinary ones for myself, since I no longer have a license to be able to buy the human version. But, so it's just really fun teaching those skills and seeing people wanting to be self-sufficient. But in conjunction with what we talked about today, I am also developing right now a workshop and a course about law and finance that will cover many topics like taxes, criminal charges, which are really actually also part of the commerce system, private banking, and, what is money, and how to actually, become competent and execute your trust through this system that was set up for you.
Fabulous.
And several other, law issues. And I think I'm going to debut that at Acapulco in Mexico.
Awesome. Much needed. And I know there are a lot of people out there teaching these kinds of things. And I'll just say one of the reasons I would recommend people to learn about this from you. Even though I don't know you that well, my sense of you, Andy, is that you have excellent pattern recognition. and I think I mentioned this earlier at some point, but one of the best ways to understand one system is to actually go learn about something. Like if you study nature and then you understand how water works in nature, you actually understand how it works in the human organism. But it's a lot harder to just start here, especially because it's subjective. So I think the fact that you took your background in molecular biology and psychiatry and psychiatric or forensic psychiatry, and now you're applying that skill of yours to the economic system, I think it is going to lend itself in a different and unique way from someone who's just immersed in law or economics, period. So I'm looking forward to that. You will see me inside that course of yours. I'd love to learn with you about that. So thank you for your time today.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, we'll make sure to get all of the links. And I was saying this to you before we hit the record button. I want to make sure to include it here in the recorded version. I was attempting to do a Google search of Andy in preparation for this talk today, and he's very difficult to find. He's one of the most censored individuals, I think, on the internet, heavily shadow banned. And so, if you're Googling his name, Dr. Andrew Kaufman, you might not find him. So we will leave the exact hyperlinks you need to make sure you get straight there, wherever you're watching or listening to this podcast. So if you're not finding him on a Google search, come back and find the direct link here. We'll make sure to include it. Anything else I didn't cover that you want to make sure, links or anything like that you want to? Or are we good?
No, I'm sure that my team can give you that information.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Andy.
All right. Thank you. Take care.